Okay, in our last lecture, I ended the history of ethics in a way, what would be a usual introduction to ethics course, by discussing Hegel's view of ethics with its what one might call its super concept of freedom. The very large concept of freedom as formulating those goals and desires of individuals in whatever given historical period, and the idea that freedom represents is to see those goals and obstacles and their overcoming in that period, and to name that activity and those sets of practices freedom. Now, that side of Hegel's philosophy, and Hegel is perhaps the most important philosopher in the 19th century, because the people that I will talk about today, at least the first two or three, react against Hegel. So Hegel's view is very important, but the Hegel I gave you the other day is a very radical Hegel, where freedom is the central notion. But there's another side to Hegel, as many of you may have suspected if you've looked at articles like Fukuyama's The End of History, something like that. There's another side of Hegel, a more conservative side, that argues that while his view remains historical, that history is, as it were, the context within which all activities, truth, and so on gets its meaning, in which human beings become what he calls spirit. The conservative Hegel, that reading of Hegel, he argues that the culmination of this long historical process is something like the Prussian state, or on an updated reading like Fukuyama's. And this is one that I think it perfectly fits what George Bush means by the New World Order. It means that history proper is at an end. This is a very strange notion, because we still, I think, to some extent, think historically. History proper is at an end because the human race has found the right ideas. Namely, liberal democracy, by which we mean the televised pseudo-state, try to speak, and VCRs. Once you have an economy that produces VCRs and stuff, and a pseudo-state that gives you the satisfaction of lording it over the rest of the planet with a social system that doesn't work, history's reached its end, and there are no more battles over big ideas. That's the point. That as long as the Cold War was going on, there were ideologies and battles between them. Socialism, capitalism, and so on. But with the end of the Cold War, this is the updated version of Hegel's argument. Well, now that's interesting already, because it needed to be updated. See, since Hegel thought it was over in the 19th century, this more recent article argues that history ended in the 20th century, only to have the Gulf War come along. And if there's one sure sign in Hegel's philosophy that history isn't over, of course it's a war, because they're embodied people in struggle with different views about what freedom is and how to live. So now there'll have to be another update about it being over. So I'm very skeptical about that claim, and also the conservative Hegel, for other reasons, would not be my favorite. In any case, reacting to the philosophy of Hegel were a whole set of intellectuals, and he has an ambiguous legacy. There were right-wing Hegelians and left-wing Hegelians. In fact, one of the origins of right-wing, left-wing was not simply where people sat in a French theater, although that's another origin of the word. One has to do with these two schools of readings of Hegel. The right-wing Hegelians took Hegel to be fundamentally right, and their only task was to apply his method of investigation to subject after subject. In other words, just investigate the Prussian state, spell out explicitly what he hadn't quite said enough of. Said enough about. The other school of Hegelians were the left-wing Hegelians, one of whom later became very famous, and he will be the first person I'll discuss today as we move beyond what I consider to be rather narrow ethical concern. While the problems we discussed in the last few lectures I consider important, they are much narrower concerns than the best kind of social arrangements within which human beings can realize their character and so on. And those lead to a whole larger set of issues. So those are the ones we'll discuss today. Those are the ones that were raised by Hegel under the word freedom. And as I say, the most famous left-wing Hegelian to take up the challenge of giving a richer concept of freedom, I've already mentioned, was Karl Marx. Marx's name, of course, is not used much anymore. You know, and this is supposed to be what happened in the last 15 years, is that definitively his view of the world has been refuted, and so on. And I would like to warn against these relatively premature judgments, especially in the long scope of history. After all, communism is an ideology. In the Soviet Union, the first communist state, began in 1917, and it is hardly a long historical run to go from 1917 to 1989 and to win hearts and minds in 2/3 of the world, and then and be over like that. That is the kind of historical view a culture might have if that culture's view of history was based on mini-series, because then you could go, well, that was kind of like a mini-series in this longer story. But as a matter of just historical fact, the text of Marx is a classic text. William Bennett agrees it's a classic. It's in the great book, so there you go. It's a classic, okay? No more argument needed, right? Bennett, you know, Bush's Hash's man, says it's a classic, so it's a classic. And then in the historical sense, it's still an ambiguous legacy, because throughout the history of Marxism, based on this Hegelian mode of thought in which concepts change as people change, there was an ongoing criticism, which, as we know today in Eastern Europe, has led to the overthrow of certain governments, an ongoing criticism within the communist states of communism. That didn't appear obvious to us over here until these dramatic events, as though they hadn't been prepared for by a long historical process of criticism. Of course, we were blinded to that on our side of the border for Orwellian reasons, for strictly Orwellian reasons. But now we see, by this period of history, we see that there were quite important social movements that do deserve the name democratic movements, in a way that very few movements in this country deserve the name. I mean, a movement that serious as for democracy in the United States would have to be either associated with dangerous African Americans with strange ideas that have made bizarre off-the-record remarks or something, or else in some other way ghettoized. Real movements for democracy are, oddly enough, most threatening in nominal democracies. That's a principle of Hegelian discourse. In other words, if you live by an ideology, the most dangerous ideology to you is your own, because someone may expect you to do what you say. So, in that sense, communist ideology, as many of you know, was never a real threat in the United States, right? Very few communists got elected to Senate and so on. It's just not really popular. On the other hand, our own ideologies of democracy, freedom, and equality have been a great danger to our own society. So that's a dialectical truth, and leads me into Marx and Marx's criticism of capitalism, because there's a wide misunderstanding, and I need to explain why a criticism of capitalism is a criticism of Hegel. Because for Hegel, if that was the highest expression of humanity, was this advent of capitalism, the liberal democratic state, and so on, then a criticism of that state, you know, which had been based on the previous French Revolution and so on, would be a criticism not just of Hegel, but of the state of affairs his philosophy represented. And that was Marx's real point, not just merely to interpret Hegel or criticize him, but to use him as a vehicle to criticize the actual state in terms of the degree to which at first it's an internal criticism. It's a criticism of the gap between the promises of the bourgeois state and its practices. And that criticism is launched in terms of the economy. The argument is rather elegant and rather simple. And I mean, Marx has many complicated arguments. I'm going to stick to a few from this book, The Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844 by Marx. It's an inexpensive little book. The problem is that the democratic state is, and Marx uses a rather strong word here, in contradiction with the imperatives of the capitalist economy. Now, I'm not sure many people would even want to disagree with that anymore, I think that we're used to living in a sort of televised environment in which contradictions don't bother us as much as they used to. They just make us twinge. In other words, we'll see a huge picture of rubble on TV, and a spokesman will be saying, there was no rubble. And the rubble's behind you. And we're used to that now. And we've lived through periods where Richard Nixon would come on TV and say, I am not a liar. And his eyes would drift off, So we're more used to contradiction than they were and take it less seriously. We expect it. In fact, certain cultural artifacts of our period, like Twin Peaks, make a joke out of our ability to accept contradiction. They use it in a way as a kind of irony on our society, that we can accept it with very little difficulty. But this wasn't true in this period, so it was an important criticism if Marx could show that the imperatives of the economy to accumulate human labor, which for Marx was the key to capital, not accumulating money, because money was a medium, right, that was used to accumulate living labor. That's what is the fundamental meaning of the alienation of labor for Marx. To put it in really basic terms, it's this. The secret to capitalism is moving from a society, and this is why it has ethical implications that I'd like to draw, moving in a society where the question is, what are you, to a society in which the question is, what do you own or have? What do you do in the sense of a career, a job, or whatever? Once human beings are redescribed in that way, they're redescribed in terms of their work time, which is not voluntary. I mean, Reagan recognizes that, right? He distinguishes voluntarism from work. He's that smart. And we all know when we're at work, we're not volunteering. And one way you can know, no matter how much you love your job, everybody always tells me I love my job, that very few people, when they're given 2 months off at full pay, decide to come in every day and work their butt off. It's just, Americans may love their jobs, but they may also have deep psychological reasons to believe that compensatory thing, namely that they do really love it. They may, in fact, be devious in some respect. It's deeper than a conscious one, which we'll discuss when we get to Freud. So for Marx, the crime, as it were, that capital commits, and it's not I shouldn't even use the word crime, because it's purely systemic, and it has dual effects, one of which is incredibly positive. The negative effect it has is to reduce the rich amount of human needs to needs that can simply be bought and sold on a marketplace. In other words, to make us understand our needs in terms of marketable needs. And this is almost a boring lecture now, because our need for love, compassion, understanding, for social relations, and so many other needs now are all merchandisable. I mean, even one of the kinkiest things people used to do, which is to have intimate sexual conversations with one another, now that's telephonized, and you put it on your Visa, right? I mean, just think of that one example about telephone sex. This is how far capitalism can go in rationalizing what at one time was a very intimate personal exchange without the mediation of money into one that becomes marketable. So if you're watching USA on television late at night, which I sometimes do, it's got all those stupid B-movies on it, then here come on a whole stream of lovely young men and women saying, call me up. $5 a minute. If you're lonely, sad, tired, want a friend, there's one on the market.